Symposium. My name is Lacee Satcher. I'm a sociology faculty here at BC, and I'll be moderating this session. The title of this session is Reclaiming Land, Preserving Places. I'll give a very brief introduction to each of our speakers, and then we'll start with Mr. Mitchell. All right. Thomas Mitchell is a national expert on property issues facing disadvantaged families and communities and has published leading scholarly works addressing these matters in academic journals, government publications, and publications for trade associations such as the American Bar Association. Mitchell holds the Robert F. Drinan S.J. Endowed Chair at BC Law and serves as the director of the Initiative on Land, Housing, and Property Rights, which seeks to help disadvantaged people and communities acquire and secure important property rights. Prior to joining Boston College in 2022, Mitchell engaged in extensive law reform and policy work, most prominently serving as the principal drafter of a widely adopted Uniform Real Property Act named the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, which is designed to substantially enhance the ability of disadvantaged families to maintain ownership of their property and their property-related generational wealth. In 2020, Professor Mitchell was named one of 21 recipients of the MacArthur Fellowship in recognition of the substantial impact his professional work has had in assisting disadvantaged farmers and property owners. Everett Fly is a professional landscape architect and architect based in San Antonio, Texas. He is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. His interdisciplinary practice has evolved over 42 years to include private, commercial, and public clients. He has gained national recognition for his Black Settlements in America research and implementation projects on African American resources and communities in 17 states and the District of Columbia. He has served on municipal and state historic review boards, prepared historic American building survey documents, and successfully written National Register of Historic Places nominations. His preservation clients have included family groups, local governments, state agencies, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the National Park Service. In 2014, he was one of 10 recipients of the National Humanities Medal from President Barack Obama. In 2021, he received the National Daughters of the American Revolution Historic Preservation Medal. That same year, he received one of 3 Harvard University Graduate School of Design Alumni Awards. So please welcome both of our presenters, and we'll start with Mr. Mitchell.
Good morning. I just want to thank the Clough Center. I want to thank Jonathan and Nicholas for this tremendous symposium that you've put on. It's an honor to be part of it. So I'm going to talk about property laws, recognition, and kind of vindication of claims of attachment to place. These are just a few kind of private and public laws that have facilitated the loss of property among Black, Brown, and other disadvantaged communities. I'll note I'll have some reference to this law called partition, and I'll also reference eminent domain, which historically haven't vindicated or validated claims that various communities have made in terms of their particular attachments to place historically, right? Okay, so a lot of the roots of my kind of interest in this area and work derives from the fact that I was born and raised in San Francisco. I'm familiar with the story of Wong Kim Ark. And for me, it was very formative. Although in college, I never studied urban history. I didn't study anything in law school. But as I was thinking about doing a fellowship, I kind of thought that was kind of a research-based fellowship. What has animated me? What do I think about in my free time? And it really kind of goes back to my childhood. Born in '65, and in San Francisco at that time, there's an area of the city, sometimes called the Western Addition, sometimes called the Fillmore District, and this was a site of urban renewal. And so part of the construction of place is there was the actual situation on the ground if we're talking about in the 1940s, 1950s. There was constructed place in terms of aspirationally about what the Western Addition could be. And then there was kind of the reality. So just kind of historically, this in the, before World War II, this was an area of the city where there were a lot of Japanese Americans. 60% of the property was owned by Japanese Americans. They get interned. And then the city thinks, aha, this is our moment to, it's an opportunity to like reconstruct the area. Problem is, then you had a lot of African Americans who moved in who had come to build in the Navy shipyard. And they're the only public housing in the city that was built during the wartime was in the Western Addition. And so you have this leaders in the city, both in terms of government, in terms of private industry, kind of working together, see this as a moment of opportunity. They describe the Western Addition as being blighted. So they intentionally highlight some of the deficits, some of the overcrowding. They downplay a lot of the cultural history and prominent businesses, right? And they sell the important stakeholders of this utopian dream of what the Western Addition could become. All of their PR materials, all white families living in these green spaces with cultural centers. And the narrative gets played up about all of the deviance and the overcrowding and the blight, right? Whereas the reality was was much different in terms of what the conditions were on the ground. So as you can see just in some of the photos, obviously the Western Addition wasn't all blighted. It had in the 1940s and 1950s, it had more jazz clubs, black-owned jazz clubs than anywhere west of Harlem. So very rich kind of cultural, very rich kind of restaurants of kind of different ethnicities. But ultimately, the San Francisco Redevelopment Authority declares it as blighted. It's an agency that in significant ways is captured by business interests who are intentionally trying to mold public opinion, so playing up deviancy, playing up overcrowding. And then there's just massive displacement. They decide that it can't be fixed, so to save the community, they got to destroy the entire community, right? So you see massive numbers of households displaced, 883 businesses displaced, more than 2,500 Victorians destroyed. And so on the front end, kind of weak protections in terms of attachment to place, this malleable definition of blight. And on the back end, to sell this, the city basically says is, this is going to be great for the business interests. They're going to profit. It's going to be great for the tax revenues, the property tax revenues, because we're going to increase the property values. And then the third prong is, though these mostly black folks, they're not going to be able to live in this utopian, right? It's going to be too expensive for them. We'll provide other housing options for them, at least sometime in the future. And indicating that some of them would actually have this right of return. And that turned out to be completely mythical, right? They ended up giving these residents these, quote, certificates of preference, distributed about 7,000 of them. Only 1,500 were actually utilized, mostly because the city denied them. Now the question was it intentional racism or was it incompetency? And then with respect to the businesses, only 4% of the businesses, they were also given this right of return. Basically, they were given this certificate, said that, well, when we redevelop this whole area, you get the first right to claim a space in terms of leasing. What they sold these businesses on was that all this redevelopment was going to happen in 2 to 3 years. It stretched out over 10 years. Businesses couldn't, most of them hang on for 10 years. They had scattered. The few that then tried to reclaim these certificates, the city said, yeah, we'll honor that, but it's at the current fair market rental value, not when you left, and almost none of them could afford that, right? And then we have, so what's interesting when I say that this construction of space is to sell it. We're selling deviancy, we're selling blight, we're selling crime, and that's why the whole place needs to be remade. There's some acknowledgement, years later that things didn't quite turn out the way they did. First of all, the utopian developments never totally happened. I mean, you can just compare this bottom left photo to the bottom right photo. It's at the same intersection. I don't know, is that utopian? I mean, maybe going to Walgreens is utopian. But you have, what the city has had some acknowledgement that, we should have done it a different way. And that there was this heritage, right? So they talked about forming this historic jazz district. Grossly have underinvested that, hasn't turned out. But in place of that, if you go down Fillmore Street today, there's these banners of these flags of black jazz musicians as a nod to the rich heritage of these these black jazz clubs, something I never heard about when I was a kid, right? If they were talking about the Fillmore, the Western Edition, and the San Francisco Chronicle, Examiner, it was all about pimps and prostitutes and crime. So that was my initial, as a child, I kind of experienced this as a loss. Wasn't familiar with laws or policies or the intersection between government and business. But that became formative me in terms of my research. So, I kind of expanded my research because I got interested. My father was, some people say he was the first black ophthalmologist in San Francisco, but he was born into poverty in Newark, New Jersey. First person in his family to graduate from high school, let alone college, let alone NYU Medical School. But his father and mother were from the rural South. And I ended up going to a funeral with my grandfather, saw all these pictures from the rural South, and that kind of spurred my interest. And what I found is kind of similarly that in terms of some of the fundamental property laws, especially impacting these black and brown communities, little legal recognition of the importance and attachments to place, right? So, for example, this is a community I visited right outside Charleston, South Carolina. It's called Mount Pleasant. This is a community that got land. These are formerly enslaved people who, right after the Civil War, were able to buy these 10-acre plots from this former plantation. The plantation was also significant because two of the descendants of the original plantation owner, one was the original signatory to the Declaration of Independence, another was one of the initial signatories to the U.S. Constitution. So obviously this place in many ways is invested with incredible historical importance. In the early 2000s when I had visited, you had a 10-acre parcel of property that a family wanted sold, and I better speed it up. And ultimately the community wanted to buy it, but the court ordered it sold to a developer for just $1,000 more. So the community offered $1.2 million, developer offered $1.2 million and $1,000, and they said that they sold that because that was going to maximize wealth. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit. So some of my work has been to highlight how the property law fundamentally did not give us space or did not vindicate these attachments to place. But then my legal reform work, I've tried to address that. So it was mentioned that I'm the principal drafter of a model state statute, a uniform act called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. And what I was responding to is that this background state law, so it's a law called partition. So if there's a group of people own property together and somebody in the group wants to exit and they can't figure out a way consensually, you can then file a lawsuit. And the lawsuit provides a hierarchy of remedies under most state statutes. If the property is big enough, what's preferred is the physical division of the property and an allocation among the members of the group. If you can't do that, then there's a forced sale. And so essentially our statute is designed to provide greater property rights to those who want to maintain ownership, including because of claims to attachment to place. And these are three pillars of the statute. I'm just going to drill down and focus on one of them. So the background law in every state said that when the court's making this decision about whether to physically divide or sell, that they use purely an economics only test, right? They look at, does the property have economies of scale? Is it worth more if it's sold as a whole than the aggregate value of the parcels that would result from a physical division? And if they have these economies of scale, it should be sold, right? That's going to be wealth maximizing. No role for attachment to place or culture or history. So in drafting the act, I specifically said, okay, well, economic concerns are important, but these other concerns are equally important. And so this is just 3 of the provisions in the statute, but one is longstanding ownership within a family. Another is other indications of sentimental attachment, right? Even if it's not longstanding ownership, you can demonstrate attachments to place, or if the property had particular cultural significance or historical significance. And the degree to which, if somebody was displaced from the property, that they would suffer a great loss, including in terms of their quality of housing. All right, so could you just, so essentially when I started, kind of in legal academia, we've had a school of academic thought, law and economists, who have been very strong. And folks told me, no state's going to agree with you. And so precisely 0 states will recognize this attachment to place because it's non-quantifiable, it's indeterminate, the economic standard is much more objective. So now we're sitting at 21 states, the District of Columbia and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and we're on the cusp of getting a passage in Arizona and Michigan as well. And I just say that's a hopeful development in terms of recognition of place. Can we go back to the slides? All right, so these are just a few different samples of states, but in many of these states, when I testify and others I work with testify in the state legislature, we very much focus on attachments to place. In Missouri, we actually renamed our act the Save the Family Farm Act to show that tie, right? Okay, next. Oh, it's me. Sorry. All right, so I just want to end on this note, right? So in terms of the trajectory of my work, at least with respect to these disadvantaged communities, it was a starting point where there was no recognition of attachment to place in the law, in the property laws that I study, right? I've shown you some hopeful in terms of this one particular law, but I don't want to necessarily overplay it. So these are I'm going to describe why I have these 4 photos, right? The first 2 on the top are communities that experience eminent domain. So our pink house on the left, there's a famous Supreme Court eminent domain case, Kelo versus City of New London. This is Suzette Kelo and her pink house. The Supreme Court ruled there that you can use eminent domain for purely economic development. Major societal blowback against this, and based on Suzette Kelo's attachment to place, and which we had is then state reforms of eminent domain law that in many states have outlawed the use of eminent domain for purely economic development. So that case, there's been movies made about it, it's all in the pop culture. The case on the right, Mid-City New Orleans. This is a neighborhood that is 27 blocks in New Orleans, 165 properties were on the National Historic Registry. The city decides after Katrina that there's local interest. They want these 2 new hospitals. They decide we're going to destroy this neighborhood, which they do. And most of the folks there didn't even get the market value of their property. And precisely outside of some areas of New Orleans, precisely no media coverage because this is normalized, all right? But then we have the case that got a lot of national, international attention a couple years ago in California, Bruce's Beach. It's the only time in U.S. history where a black family that was dispossessed of their land from the government actually got it back, and part of the claim that helped them was this deep attachment to place, this deep meaning in terms of the black community, because the Bruces ran this resort that attracted lots of black families from many states, and basically the city of Manhattan Beach, it was eminent domain abuse. They basically said the public purpose we need your land for is to build a park. It turns out they didn't build the park for decades because the public purpose was to get black people out of Manhattan Beach. And then the last thing I'll just end on is kind of a hopeful note. So I mentioned that Phillips community in South Carolina outside of Mount Pleasant that I visited in 2006, 2007. Just this past fall, the Phillips community is the first black settlement in South Carolina to be placed on the National Historic Register of Places. And they've been able to beat back attempts to widen a highway that would be destroying because of claims of the historical importance and attachments of place. So I'd say that we have, there's been some movement. You have President Biden just recently announced he's going to devote hundreds of millions of dollars to try to help black and brown communities where national highways destroyed during the 1950s and 60s. So all I'll say is compared to where I started, where there was no recognition of this in the law, we actually have some hopeful movement. And I'll end it there.
Thank you, Thomas. Thanks to all of you showing up this morning. Thanks to the Clough Center for having me. You heard in the introduction, it's another chance for me to get to come back to Boston. We have a limited amount of time, and as you heard in the introduction, I've been working on this for more than 40 years. So I can't cram all this into 12 minutes and take you on the journey. So what I'm going to try to do is give you a few appetizers. I really enjoy doing these presentations. No disrespect to Thomas, the other speakers yesterday were tremendous, but I really like to talk to the audience. They ask questions that I haven't thought about, and they give us opportunities to share our knowledge and share our points of perspective. So if it seems short, it's intentional because I want you to ask questions, and I think you'll see as Thomas and I interact and we talk with Lacee, kind of what we're trying to get at. Again, as you heard in the introduction, my undergraduate training was at the University of Texas at Austin in architecture, and my master's training was at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and Landscape Architecture. So I understand fully what an Olmsted Park is and what it's about. I understand fully what an H.H. Richardson architectural piece is or is about. But when I was at the Graduate School of Design, I had one class taught by John Brinkerhoff Jackson, and he made the mistake of mentioning that black folks after emancipation established black towns. Now, I had never heard that up until that point. And so what I've learned over the 40 years is that there's a tremendous amount of underrepresentation. And in these communities, there's no one template. I'm not going to be able to give you a template that you can take back and just stamp it on your place or on your community and it'll work. They're all a little bit different. There's all a little bit of a different twist to them. And that's the part that always intrigues me. It's like a big puzzle, trying to put it together. So this is going to be a little bit improvisational because I was at the presentations yesterday and taking notes, and there were so many excellent thoughts. And I'm a real fan, you heard in the introduction, of interdisciplinary design and thinking and work. And so at the end, I have a couple of challenges for you, in the audience. You heard in the last earlier presentation, Professor Frost mentioned the 14th Amendment, and you heard Thomas talk about the connections to folks being swindled out of their property and out of their land. And so as I started my research and the practical application, I came across the black codes, which said that As Thomas and Professor Frost pointed out, black folks couldn't buy land, but how did they get these communities and how did they get these towns? So the approach I use, as I said, it's multidisciplinary. Even though I'm an architect, I'm always looking for a drawing, I'm always looking for a plan, a building, or a landscape. But as I said, the African American experiences are so underrepresented. And again, I'm not going to be able to go through all of this, but this is kind of a sample of the kind of a checklist. When I start, of course, I look at the top left, the public records and documents. And Professor Frost, I had the great experience a number of years ago going to the National Archives, and they got so tired of me, somebody finally explained that there's a cartographic division of the National Archives. And they got so tired of me coming and filling out this was before all the digital stuff, and so you had to fill out the checkout sheet slips and so forth. So they would take me into the stacks and lock me in. and they'd come back every hour or so and, do you need to go to the bathroom or do you need to get out? But it opened up this enormous, I cannot begin to tell you, the enormous trove of parallel, coincidental, and overlaying information. So the public records is important. The map up here at the top right, you see that? That's an 1878 map of Grand Bay, Canada. And if you look right there, it says Negro settlement. Okay, Negro settlement. So somebody was keeping track, somebody was making note, and so forth. A couple of other points I'll make that you might not think about. Zora Neale Hurston, the African-American folklorist from the Harlem Renaissance, her childhood home was Eatonville, Florida. Eatonville is the oldest black incorporated town in the state of Florida. I'm not going to get into the debate about what's the oldest in the United States, but it's still intact, and the original 1887 incorporated boundary of Eatonville is still there, and that's what Zora is writing about. So you might not think about literary references, but when you read, for example, this one, Dust Tracks on a Road, that road, Zora's Road, is still there in Eatonville, okay? The photographic records, again, National Archives and Library of Congress has a photographic collection, and there are experts at the library or contract folks that they make a living just by looking at the clothes that those people are wearing. They can start to give you dates. So I'm piecing together this information. Private collections, this is out of a family Bible, and they've handwritten the names of the descendants, the names of folks when they died, when they were buried, and so forth. Archaeology, I have a great relationship with archaeologists, field research, and this especially comes up if you're dealing with an African-American cemetery or any cemetery. There's some amazing things. Professor Alex, we were talking earlier about things that you can do with LIDAR, ground penetrating radar, and now you can do drone flights and see things from above that you couldn't see before. One other thing I'll mention here, oral history. I always, especially in communities of color, it's important to build a trust with the community and sit down with them and talk about the ancestors. Like we heard yesterday, the poem reading, and she talked about talking with her mother, and the mother introduces you to an aunt, and the aunt introduces you to a great-great, and before you know it, you've started to piece together this documentation. And it is documentation, and it fits together so that, as Thomas was pointing out, you can build a case, another case of another type of value associated with these places or sites or structures. So, and again, as you heard in the introduction, I've done quite a bit of work with the National Register of Historic Places and some work with UNESCO. And I point this out not not to say that every property or every site has to meet the National Register criteria. This is a point of reference that you can use. These programs are a point of reference that you can use. And you heard Thomas read some of them, but for example, in UNESCO, a UNESCO World Heritage property, a couple of the criteria, one says to represent a masterpiece of human creative genius. That doesn't mean that it has to be an Olmsted Park, okay? We're all humans, so it could be a vernacular plan or vernacular piece. Another criteria says to bear a unique or at least exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or to a civilization which is living or which has disappeared. Another criteria says to be an outstanding example of a traditional human settlement, land use, or sea use, which is representative of a culture or cultures or human interaction with the environment, especially when it has become vulnerable under the impact of irreversible change. So when you start looking at these places and neighborhoods and settlements, the threats are real. You've heard Thomas outline them, and they can be documented. In the case of the National Register of Historic Places, the criteria says, some of them, for example, it says sites or places that are associated with events that have made significant contributions to the broad patterns of our history, that are associated with the lives of persons significant in our past, that embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or that represent the work of a master, or that possess high or artistic values, or that represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. And so this gets you into the vernacular. It may not have all the articulation that an H.H. Richardson building would have, but it has a distinct cultural relationship. And then just a couple of projects. This is one I did in 2012 in Buffalo, New York, the Michigan Street Heritage Culture Corridor. And they were focused on Harriet Tubman because Buffalo was one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. But I call it pulling threads. Once we got to pulling threads, the oral history and talking with the community folks, we found all of these other connections. For example, Frederick Douglass spoke at Front Park in Buffalo. That is Julius Rosenwald, the CEO of Sears and Roebuck, started the Rosenwald Fund. Rosenwald donated money for the Michigan Street Colored YMCA. And in the 1940s, Jackie Robinson played baseball as a minor leaguer before he broke the color barrier with the Dodgers. Advocacy, enlightenment, and reconnection. It's important when you're working with the communities to every generation that you can get involved and every generation that you can expose and every segment of the government folks, the representatives, the council members that you can expose to this is important. To expose to these stories, connect them and tie them together. Two gentlemen, two gentlemen here, once we uncovered this site, got them out there and then walked them through, and just in one afternoon, the things that they told me, it was just amazing. I think this is next to last. Are we saving history or are we saving myths? Believe it or not, that's the African American History Memorial on the southwest grounds of the Texas Capitol. And it includes two heroic figures, but on the other side, it includes kind of general representation of different African American folks that contributed to the history of Texas. On the right, this is Arlington National Cemetery, Section 42. The reason I show that to you is that many people, and I discovered this a long time ago, that many people don't know that there are African Americans that are buried in Arlington because they're descendants of a lady named Mariah Syphax. Mariah was the biological daughter of Martha Washington. After the Civil War ended, Arlington Estate, which was the estate of Robert E. Lee, was confiscated by the federal government, and that's what led to the creation of Arlington Cemetery. And the graves of those anonymous African Americans are buried in Section 42 in Arlington. So the conclusion, and I'll give you the big one for me, is that, Jonathan, this has been a remarkable conference, and the range of disciplines and the range of thought and the depth of thought is exactly the kind of thing that we need. And I challenge all of you, if anybody leaves here without forming a partnership or a connection with another discipline, you've wasted your time. You've wasted your money, and don't call me because this was your opportunity. Again, I want to encourage you to follow the leads, follow the passions that you've expressed today, and we're going to have some questions and answers, Thomas, and I'll be glad to fill in the gaps with some of those examples that I showed you, and look forward to the discussion.
Alrighty, thank you all. Thanks again to our amazing speakers. And so before we open up questions to the audience, I just have one general question for both Thomas and Everett to kind of start this conversation. And so Thomas, you are an attorney doing great work around housing and land and property rights. And Everett, you are an architect working on this really amazing multidisciplinary research on Black settlements. So can you all just speak briefly to how you all see your work sort of interconnecting?
So I think, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, so I think that just in terms of my work, when I saw that there had been little recognition of the importance of place, you didn't typically find this in case law. There was actually very little case law. So when I started, if you're a lawyer, you're a legal academic, we have basically two databases, Westlaw and Lexis. If it's a state court opinion, it's almost always an appellate opinion. So this whole phenomenon I stumbled upon about this family-owned land is called heirs property. There wasn't a single case that mentioned this. There wasn't a single textbook. I stumbled upon it because I was doing, as a graduate student, field research, and in various cities, mostly in the rural South, and folks kept telling me about this heirs property, and I initially thought, are you talking about heir rights? Like, I don't know what you're talking about. So they had to explain, it's basically families who are transmitted property from one generation to another without a will or an estate plan, and they're the legally defined heirs. But, so first of all, the phenomenon wasn't covered at all. I kind of stumbled upon it. I often say it was flying under the radar, but hiding in plain sight. But then there wasn't a well-developed body of case law or of law that recognized this phenomenon, and there was just this kind of blanket approach that the best thing to do was sell it. And so as I was kind of trying to push back again, it says I'm trying to make the argument that there are these other important values, and part of it is relying upon work of people like Everett who are going out and documenting the kind of historical importance of this. So most of the stuff I was relying on was from social scientists, folks like Everett, that were at least beginning to document the kind of inherent value of this property to these African American families and communities.
Sure. Again, as an architect and a landscape architect, governing ordinance of a governing state or a nation state come into play. They're building ordinances, building codes. You heard Thomas talk about the eminent domain. So as an architect, if I'm working on a project, that's got to be in my checklist. I was approached by actually people outside of Texas asking me to help them plan. You heard Thomas show in his example, he showed Bruce's Beach. I did not work on Bruce's Beach, but it turns out that there were more than a dozen African American resorts stretching from Bruce's Beach to up to Martha's Vineyard. So people were asking, do we own this land? So my question was, do you have a deed, legal document? And if the deed has a property description, what we call meets and bounds from corner to corner, if you have a survey, then that's a legal document in itself. And so I'm building a case for these folks, these property owners, and I need an attorney that can help me help them retain custody and make sure that we meet the code and building requirements. And so that's kind of how we got in touch. But when I started, I didn't realize what a national issue this was. I was just working on one spot or one site. But it's an ongoing challenge and something we all need to pay attention to right now.
Great. Thank you all. All right. We're going to open it up to the audience. I see a hand in the very back.
Thank you all so much. That was really fantastic. Really great presentation. I had a specific question, which is, Thomas, when you mentioned the Biden plan in terms of the federal interstate system, it just made me think of the gamut of cases where there's been erasure, and so you don't have a space or a land that it's been taken. So I was wondering how you deal with those spaces where there's been these histories of erasure, and how can you come back around to it in a way to market? I think between, Everett, I know you've worked on a lot of projects like that, and maybe Thomas too, cases that you've looked at like that.
Yeah, so, I think there's been a lot of documenting of this is throughout the country in terms of cities where there was a thriving kind of black community and the highway came in and just totally bisected it. So there's, certainly there's a lot of documentation on those, and I think that's, when I just looked at the Biden plan, they're starting with places like in Milwaukee and Detroit where you still have, maybe it's a reduced black neighborhood, but it's kind of still there. But in terms of the other end of the spectrum, I guess when you're talking about there's complete erasure, right? I think that becomes very difficult to remedy. You're talking far more resources than a typical, say, unit of government, be municipality wants to spend. San Francisco is kind of a good case. I still kind of get pissed off when I go there and I see that they hanging of these banners, right? So people say, oh, see, they're valorizing, they're recognizing, and I'm like, no, they didn't make the investment in terms of establishing that restored historic district, and for tourist purposes now, they're capitalizing on this history, right? So they ignored the history when they wanted to take the land, and now that they've basically pushed out all the black folks, now they're capitalizing on it, and it shows the city doesn't want to make the financial commitment to really restore what had been there, and relies on this. Well, we established this district, but then downplays that they've underinvested, and they're like, well, we got the banners. So I think that becomes a real problem.
So I have an additional thought. Again, I'm from San Antonio, and historic preservation is kind of in our DNA. And I'm not saying that you all have to do what San Antonio does, but we have 32 historic districts and counting, okay? If you want to build anything in the core of the city of San Antonio, you have to go through the historic preservation checklist. The city of San Antonio has an official Department of Historic Preservation, it's not only composed of historians, and they're traditional historians, but there are 2 dedicated cultural historians. There are 3 full-time archaeologists. There are 2 architectural historians. You get what I'm saying? It's not just a one generic kind of a thing. And so we're used to, we joke about it in San Antonio, we'll duke it out with you. And because we understand that this kind of preservation and commemoration and memory, it is not for the faint of heart, okay? And so we've had several challenges. I know Thomas takes a different route, but a couple of examples I'll give you, and I'll try not to take too much time because I want to get to back to the questions, but you heard me talk about the documentation. Once again, I mentioned the National Archives and the Library of Congress, but if it's a federal highway project, they've got to file those documents. And there might be a chance, I'm not going to guarantee it, but there might be a chance that those documents are somewhere in the archives. A few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I was asked to come to Charlottesville, Virginia, exactly, Jonathan, for what you're talking about. And this was right before that Charlottesville event, fortunately. But they were planning to put a highway through an area called the Sammons, S-A-M-M-O-N-S, Sammons property. And they had hired a consultant, and they did what I would call a, quote, windshield survey. They drove down the road and they said, yeah, that looks important, that looks important. And when they got to this one tract, it was a vernacular house. It didn't, here I'm back to it didn't have the style, classical style like of H.H. Richardson or SOM or somebody like that. It was a vernacular house. But the local Virginia Historical Society had did some deed research, and that's how they found out that it belonged to the Sammons family. And when they did the census research, which is much easier to do now because of things like Ancestry, they did the census research, they found that they were cousins of Sally Hemings, okay, that connected to Thomas Jefferson, okay, because they're in the area. And there was a cemetery back there, and some of the cemetery headstones had names, and they were able to tie it to that family, and they were able to defeat the highway, get them to stop doing it. So it's possible, but it's an expensive, as Thomas has pointed out, it's expensive research. You can't just go out and find something in the library or find a book. This is information. He's building a database. I'm working on it. There's some other folks, but you can challenge these things like these highway erasures.
Right. I just say that it's easier as a prophylactic before they've wiped it out, as
Right.
opposed to trying to remedy it on the back end.
Thank you. All right, go ahead. You coming? Pick them up right there.
It was a wonderful presentation, Thomas. It was a very good presentation. Really, I enjoyed very much. I have a question to you about when were you able to make the argument about attachment in the legal forum? What was the argument that convinced the judge? Was that your argument, or was this the historical moment?
Yeah, I'd say that a couple things. So in some ways, I wasn't confident that if I was going to be making the argument to state court judges, that they had a body of, they were guided by a statute. The statute had this very weak, almost useless, like maybe preference for place that the common law judges then overrode. And so that wasn't, I had no faith that I could do this in terms of like actual litigation in state court. So my move was to reform the statute that the judges had to apply and build in much more robust protections. I think because of the lack of success in litigation of individual cases, and that's why folks told me when I started down this road 25 years ago, you're wasting your time. The law can't be reformed. The law is actually working as intended. Wealthy people exploiting poor people, and people who are black and brown, right? So, and then there was just kind of an assumption that the resistance we had seen with state court judges would be the same thing with members of the legislature, right? And it wasn't, I don't want to say people were making spurious arguments. There had been an attempt in several southern states to reform this law beginning in the early 70s, and they all met the graveyard. So then people were like, well, what makes you think that you could have success where there's just been nothing but failure? So I'll say a couple things. So part of it is like my messaging. So I came up with, so the previous attempts to address this were primarily brought by civil rights lawyers who highlighted the racial injustice. Okay, so I had, after college, I worked on Capitol Hill, I worked in political spaces, and I think I just have some life experience, some professional experience of thinking about different ways of messaging it. So one of the things that was different with my move is I universalized it. I didn't frame it as purely a black problem. And it's actually true. It's a form of ownership that disproportionately black and brown families have because they have rates of will making and estate planning that are significantly less. But there's probably more white families who own this type of property. So I think that was like my first move of universalizing it, saying that this impacts families of many races and ethnicities. When I was testifying in places like South Carolina, I highlighted maybe the white families a bit more, all right? And then, being attuned to other messaging, right? So certainly, not just southern states, but certainly when I was in the Deep South, I talked about property rights. I said fundamentally, this is about protecting private property rights and family real estate wealth. When I testified in Texas, I'll leave this as one anecdote. When you testify in a legislature, they'll tell you the hearing starts at whatever time. So you show up at that time, but you don't know when your bill's coming up. So, I'm in Texas House of Representatives, Judiciary Committee, testifying. The person who testified before me was advocating for a consumer protection bill. This brilliant public interest attorney, passionate about her clients, and, but I always study the members of, on the committees that I'm going to, because that's my audience, that's my jury. And, so when I did my little prep, I described the committee as containing, several members who were, extremely right-wing, and then folks who were Neanderthals. And so the Neanderthals lit into this public interest attorney on the consumer protection. I mean, it was just horrible how nasty. And I'm watching this. I'm like, I'm up next. And I remind myself, I've already had success in Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. So I'm going to stick to universalize it, emphasize private property rights, and wealth. I did say, though, that if they come after me like they came after her, I'm going to give them a piece of mind. I'm going to go out in flames. Let's stick to plan A. And I'm looking at the three Neanderthals. And I start doing my usual stick, and by the time I start talking about it's fundamentally protecting private property rights, they're nodding along with me. And so part of that is I messaged it a bit different, thinking like a lawyer. That's my audience. What are they receptive to hearing? And then tailoring it.
Okay, go ahead.
Does that work? Yeah. Thank you both. I work with faith communities, and we do environmental advocacy around this very issue. And so I was wondering what y'all's experience was, if you've worked with faith communities, and what it looks like to protect sacred and religious spaces, and just what your experience is with that. Okay.
Well, again, I'm a professional landscape architect. So a cemetery is a landscape, and of course it's a sacred and very important landscape. So as I began to work with these communities, of course, the cemeteries can be part of that, there's a school site, a church site, a cemetery site, et cetera. But many times the cemeteries that we came across were on, quote, private property, unquote. And sometimes they knew who the owners were and sometimes they didn't. And so then that's when the multidisciplinary, multiple resource research comes into play. If you can just find one name, for example, you have a chance, can't guarantee, but you have a chance to find out who are the descendants. The cemetery law varies from state to state, kind of like the property rights law. In Texas, for example, Oklahoma, and I think even Kansas, I think it comes under what they call the antiquities. And it wouldn't just cover African American cemeteries, it would cover indigenous as well. And so what you're looking for, again, is to build like a genealogy. And what I call it is I guess the attorneys would call it a chain of title, but I call it a genealogy of the land. The adjacent landowners, who are they, who are the descendants, et cetera. And if I can narrow down that immediate land genealogy, I have a chance to find out and again, build the case. I've had better success if I can show like a story, and again, that's where all the things we heard yesterday and we'll continue to hear today come into play. The social science research, the historians' research, et cetera, to tell the story of that cemetery. So I can stop there, but I could, if you have specific, questions.
Yeah, and all I'd add, we haven't, so in every state I work in, we build a coalition, and the coalition's broad-based from grassroots organizations to grass tops, so environmental organizations, organizations that represent mostly Black heirs property owners, but we also have, in many states the realtors have supported us, so we have, other folks. I would say that, we typically try to find somebody to testify. Oftentimes that their family has gone through it. Oftentimes they talk about their attachment to the property in kind of religious and spiritual terms, including in Hawaii. So the picture I showed you was like Mark Zuckerberg. So essentially what happened in Hawaii, he owns this massive estate on the island of Kauai. There were 11 Native Hawaiian families who owned property within the interior boundaries of his property, and he no longer wanted to grant them an easement. So he initiated one of these partition suits seeking a forced sale. He did it, he went to his real estate attorney and he said, listen, I want to get these families out of my property. And the advice was, well, do it soon because in 1 week, this new statute is going to become law and it's going to give them more protections. So if I'd been his lawyer and said, you're going to do better under the old law, the new law, I would say the old law. If I had been his PR person, I was like, don't ever file those suits. And so I guess he didn't talk to his PR person. And so he filed the suits 2 days before our act became law, and there was just massive media blowback, including an article, Zuckerberg tries to avoid protections of new statute. It's going to take effect. But I'd say many of, when they those families, they talk very much in spiritual terms about their attachment to the land.
Great, thank you. Do you have any other questions? Go ahead.
I can speak without them. Thank you as well for this wonderful, insightful thoughts. And I was wondering, now moving forward, you mentioned, I think, like a database and how kind of you're moving forward, how you are going to systematize this recording and maybe kind of, I can imagine just having all this information you mentioned together in one place and helping also the audience connecting the dots will make even more of a strong case in the future. And I was wondering if you can linger a bit on that.
So I'd say that, one of the things that's hopeful for me is like when I started this these kind of property legal issues were considered backwater, fringe, marginal. Very little academic scholarship on it, very little media attention, almost no appetite for elected officials and policymakers to do kind of law and policy work in the space. And so, I remember writing an article or publishing an article back in like 2010, and one of the things I was calling for was more documentation, more studies. And, there's actually been this first generation of scholarship or researchers doing things that I find kind of hopeful. So one thing is on like racially restrictive covenants. So before, 10 years ago, there had been little documentation on racially restrictive covenants. There were a lot of widespread assumptions. I mean, people knew what they were, but they must be in these, the racist states, the southern states. And there's at the University of Minnesota, for example, they have a database, and surprise, surprise, it turns out that racially restrictive covenants were dispersed all across the United States, including in liberal bastions like San Francisco and Los Angeles and the Twin Cities. So I showed you that Western edition. Well, one of the problems was that, they were saying, well, this is going to be too expensive for the black folks, but, they'll have housing. When we push them out of this area, they'll have, opportunities elsewhere. Well, that didn't take into account the pervasiveness of racially restrictive covenants in San Francisco. So there was nowhere for these folks to move in the city. So I think just that development showing that, no, this wasn't a southern state. This was all across liberal states, conservative states, and that's been helpful in terms of reframing. I think that, so that's just one example of documentation. The Fannie Mae, which is a government-sponsored entity in the housing space, has just come up with a national study about this heirs property phenomenon. So sometimes I've gotten the question, okay, well, it's more significant than we thought, but like how significant is it really? Well, they've just come out with a national study quantifying the amount. So that helps like in the policy argument. So I'd say the last thing I'd say with me, and I think Everett referred to this, is part of the reason I came to BC is I'm trying to build up an initiative, maybe a center one day. So it is initially this initiative on land, housing, and property rights. But we are fundraising, and we're hoping to hire additional staff. And one of the things they would do on the research fund is some of this documentation. So we'll see where it goes. Wish me success.
Just real quick, so there are several, because this is rising to the top of our attention, there are several coalitions that have been formed. The African American Burial Ground Network Act, I don't know if you're familiar with that. We got an uphill battle, but the act has been approved, believe it or not. There's just no money with it, and the purpose of it is for it to be managed through the National Park Service, so that the database, as folks come across these abandoned or orphaned burial ground sites, a database is documented, but there are a coalition of folks around that. And then there's a group, it's called the Black Settlements Alliance. It's a group of African-American, 5 or 6 African-American towns, Tuskegee, Alabama, Hobson City, Alabama, Grambling, Louisiana, Mound Bayou, Mississippi, Eatonville, Florida, and Princeville, North Carolina, that have banded together, and it's a 501c3, and they are collecting this data, information on black towns and settlements. And so I'm working to help them, and I'm like Thomas, I'm looking for a way to centralize this and make it more accessible, because it really is a national issue.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you all. Let's give another round of applause.